There he is, Jim, right on time.
I am here.
Jim got a camera. All right.
All right. I'm in the game.
He's in. He's in.
Took me a while to hook up with this, Greg, because for some reason I got it in my head that I was supposed to join this at 7 o'clock instead of 7:30.
I think the first one we did might have been 7.
Well, it's on your schedule. It says 7:30, and I just was set on 7 o'clock. So
sometimes it's hard to shake it. So
I was frustrated trying to get in for a while, and then I went back and looked at the schedule and said, "Aha, there it is."
Well, you made me double check it.
It's right. I mean, it's all right. I just was confused.
I need to set some of you guys up as alternate hosts in case I fall asleep some night and forget to start.
I was wondering, where's Greg? Where's Greg? Yes, turn it on.
Alan.
Yes.
You going to be there tomorrow?
At Mike's?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I assumed you was.
Oh, yeah.
I'll bring down my camera. The one that
okay.
We will find out what is in the hidden track behind the outer wall.
Well, I've got some investigating to do too. Connor just brought me a brake wheel off of a caboose.
That's a problem.
Yeah. So, who knows where it came from, but it'll show up.
Well, I finally found the stock car this afternoon where I found the door 2 weeks ago. So, because it was on the back side, it wasn't readily visible. And whoever moved that stock car moved it halfway across the layout without a door.
Bob, how are you today?
Les Breuer's here finally, gang.
Oh,
Good. Bob, how you feeling?
Yeah, Bob, we need to find out how Bob is.
Very sore.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, you see the top of your head, Bob.
That's
You gotta adjust your back.
doesn't hurt.
Tip the, there
There
you
you
go.
go.
There. Oh, shit. Put it back the way it was.
Don't complain. I've heard the girls always ask you to put a bag over your head too.
All right.
That works.
Yeah. No,
I guess we're ready, huh?
Yeah, I think we're ready. Lester, take it away.
Okay, we'll give it a try, gang. Bear with me here.
And if everybody can mute themselves, then I won't worry about it.
Hey, where's the mute? Oh, wait a minute, I found it.
Well, you don't, Lester. We don't want you to
I got
mute.
share content. Bear with me. I have to go and turn on. You got it? Can you guys see it?
no.
No? Okay, bear with me then. I'm gonna have to, I thought this was A-okay, but.
I see somebody brought the wine, so we don't have to.
Okay, guys, can you see it now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, we're ready to go. Sorry about that. I'm working with the iOS system, and there's a lot of quirks in it. All right, some of you guys know me, some of you don't. Those who don't know me, it's Lester Breuer, as you can see on the screen. And of this railroad, the Minneapolis and Northland Railroad Company, I'm, of course, consider myself the president and the chief operating officer. Now, when you come into my basement, down the stairs, this is what you see. You're walking into the Minneapolis and Northland Railroad Company. This you're actually looking at currently at Minneapolis. Now, the railroad itself is, we use the slogan, Lakeland Route. and surviving today, shaping tomorrow. This is a standard gauge short line railroad located in central Minnesota in 1955. It's a bridge route connecting the GN in Minneapolis, which you're seeing here, Chicago Northwestern in Little Chicago, which is as far as we're going to go tonight on the presentation. And on the other end of the line, the west end is the Milwaukee. And the railroad is loosely based on the MN&S. So, okay, if you go down the lower right-hand corner, you see what we call the Toman Engine House sitting in Minneapolis. The Toman Engine House was built out of a 3-stall Atlas building, and you can see, even though the seams were covered, you can see the old roundhouse roof there. If you kind of duck inside, you're going to see into a little bit of interior. Most of my buildings have an interior, and if you also notice the lights up on top, the micro-engineering lights, gentleman by the George Toman, who may be with us tonight, made those lights for me. So in this case, I named the engine house after him, and I do that with almost everything on the railroad. So you will see as we go along, things are named after friends as we go. So the engine house, of course, we come back out on the right side, you see the caboose track. Got a few snow plows sitting there. You know, this is Minnesota, so we get some snow. The important part is you go up on top of the screen, and you're now in Chestnut Street Yard. That is a copy. I tried to lay the track as the Minneapolis Northfield and Southern did on their 3rd Avenue Yard. And as their yard, it backed up against Highway 55, which you see on the right-hand corner of the screen. As we walk in, you begin to see there is that the railroad is primarily 1st-generation diesel. You can see the color scheme is blue, orange stripe, white separating stripe. The cabooses are the bay windows are the orange theme of the Milwaukee, but these are the old Varney cabooses. Then we have some of the old stubborn conductors who still we allow them to have their own caboose. So you got cabooses, a wood caboose like 120. Now, if you look back on that bridge where the track goes under, that is the Moe Smith Bridge. That is completely scratch built, and I cut every piece of lumber for that thing on my table saw. And that only occurred because a gentleman by the name of Moe Smith, who the bridge is named after, every time he looked at one of my buildings, he'd say, "Oh, nice job. The only thing is you're always using commercial materials. Can't you ever do your own?" So I finally took up the challenge and cut them. This is the one and only because I had much more sawdust than I ever had parts for the bridge. You also see that is the freight house back there. That's just design preservations, and the front team track there with the 2 tractors on is scratch built. We move on. This is the yard office for Chestnut Street Yard. That building was built for me by a friend. His name was Fred Hosaffel, and he decided HO was too small, so he moved on to G scale, and they asked me, "Would you please put this on your railroad?" Well, I didn't mind it. This was a prize-winning building with a full interior, so it's on the railroad. And of course, he had and it, by the way, is a copy of the Milwaukee Chestnut Street office that sat on Chestnut Street in St. Paul where the Milwaukee moved up to what they called, I believe, Short Line Hill on up to the Ford plant. So that building. We move on down the railroad. You start to see, as you look down, you start to see some of the other industries. If you were an operator here in the railroad, that you would be working besides the freight house that you saw. Here you have Schwenke Cement, and you have IB Fine Woolen. Now, Schwenke Cement is, again, a scratch-built building, as is IB Fine, while IB Fine Woolen is design preservation modules put together. But going back to Schwenke Cement, that is scratch-built. It's Campbell's on foam core. And again, the actual building does sit in Bloomington, Minnesota on the MN&S. I interviewed some of the people there as to loads in, loads out, etc. And you notice the panel below. That panel, for what it's worth, is that this section, Minneapolis, still was originally, that's the old DC panel. and I still can run Minneapolis in DC or DCs, depending on when the railroad is turned on. And that "I'd be fine willing" sounds kind of crazy, but the better half, that used to be one of her expressions. I don't know why. "I'd be fine." And I couldn't resist, so I created the Woolen Mill, and which sat on the MNS, actually, similar type thing in Northfield, Minnesota. You look here, we get down to Sooner Y. Again, the Sooner Y, as you notice on the back, has an attached passing siding, and the MNS, I'm sorry, the M and St. L reefer is sitting on that, on the Dawkins siding. That's named after a gentleman in our group, the Tuesday Night Roundhouse, who are normally my operators. He's an electrical guy, and when I have problems, I go to him, and he's helped me with the tortoise machines on here. They failed. They've been in there since '85, and the points burned out. So we're now got them running off of, there's some relays we put in there, 10, and never should burn out. In the back, you got the JUN interchange. And by the way, all the track you've seen to this point, including here, everything is Railcraft Code 83, Railcraft Code 83 ties, and everything here was hand laid. Okay, this yard and all this trackage took me 6 months to hand lay in 1985. The backdrop, by the way, that you see back there and saw previous, those are travel posters. We have a junk shop, we call it here. It's called the Axeman, who has several outlets, and I happened to find those posters. They were Chicago travel posters in his junk box for maybe a quarter piece, and they made wonderful backdrop trees. Okay, if we go across, if you go to the end of the GN back there and we cross, below Sooner Y here, is the siting to a small industrial siting just on the MNS. When they left the Sooner Y, there was industry. We're gonna take a quick look at those back buildings. Persky Bottling back there was again built by a friend. He had a heart condition like my son. Jim passed quite it, but before, when he started to take his railroad down, he passed along the building and he asked me, would you please put it on your railroad? And I said, Jim, I'll be, and they'll be there ever since. However, he was not pleased when he did see it later that it had a Coca-Cola bottle on it, because he was a Pepsi guy. So he thought the Coke was just something to spite him a little bit. Up front, you have Kruger's, I'm sorry, okay, Kruger's Potatoes and Vegetables. And this again is a selective compression building of the actual building. I crawled around this building, tape measures and whatever. This sits over in St. Paul. If you cross the Fort Snelling Bridge from Minneapolis, Minnesota, this building sits over there. Today it has a brand new facade, but this is the older facade. As we move back up to the front of that siting, you have thermal gas. Thermal gas, again, I crawled over that puppy with measurements, whatever. The tower back is the loading. You see the tower next to the freight car. The blue building was an N-scale pike stuff. And that building is, well, including signs, everything here is a copy of what stood up. It sits in Annandale, Minnesota on the Sioux Line, Highway 55. And this is what got me into casting when I started doing casting. You see all those little tanks up there in front of that blue shed, plus the propane tanks in back along the fence. I wasn't going to spend all the money when I looked at SS Limited. So I bought a few and I started doing my own casting from that point on. Now, when I say I crawl across the building, this is something I do out in the field and used to do, not as much anymore, getting too old for this stuff, crawling around. But you see, those are my drawings. And then if I really get down to it, when I'm going to scratch build the piece, I'll do a scale drawing of it to build it. But anyway, we move on down the line, and this is just to show you some of, we're in central Minnesota, right? And you got to have a little bit of countryside on the railroad. That, by the way, I guess is a cornerstone piece that came with the speeder. But I also wanted to show you up on top, if you look on the hillside, this is, of course, Old Woodland Scenic sitting up there, but the backdrop, I do try to do all my painting. Those are my trees that I tried painting, and later on you'll see maybe some of the clouds that I've done. Next, on the railroad, we move on down as you're you get into Northern Power, and that is again their Walters, I believe, or their Cornerstone power plant, and the office building attached to it. The head house up on top, and the rest of it is scratch built. Obviously, you see that there is a conveyor system coming out of where the boilers are located. It took me a while to figure that out. Normally, many of the power plants that I visited, the tracks go inside for the coal to go into the boilers. But in this, if it doesn't, you still, I mean, for the ash to go out and et cetera, the bottom of the boilers. So I did some research, and there were a lot of the plants did have a type of conveyor system, as you see here. So obviously, that is that empty ash car that you see there. Now, actually, it does get full, as you can see here. And all the load, that, by the way, the ash, for what it's worth, came out of my fireplace. The coal loads, all loads on the railroad, because of operation, it is an operating railroad, all loads are removable. That's the way. I didn't want to build two cars, as some guys do of each. Here's just the other view of the power plant. And if you notice the sign down in the low, right in the middle, down in the lower, you notice it's the Boss plant. And some of you guys may know Dave Boss when he retired, but him and I, how he worked for Northern States Power, we went through every facility in the Twin City area and out as far as Mankato, all the existing. So I got a pretty good feel over time, and of course enjoyed the power plant tours. So we had to have one on the railroad. As we move on down, you get it to Bass Lake Junction, and you can see the coal yard is still in the back there. If you look at that small station, or I guess you call it a flag stop on the right side, that little flag stop actually was on the MNNS. The plans are in Lukey's book, and it stood in Orchard Gardens. And the guy sitting there in the truck with his milk cans, during an operating session, we run the milk peddler, which comes out of Minneapolis, where you saw, picks up milk cans on the way. We'll see what couple more. The station on the right, or on the left, I'm sorry, is that's a Cornerstone series, but I didn't like the plastic, so I cut out all the panels and replaced them with northwestern siding, and a little Campbell roof, whatever. Now, if you look back under that bridge, which you see a siding going back there, that the backdrop divides that, and we use that siding really as the rip track for the railroad. Here's the cleaner train that usually I run before every operating session. As you notice, that's an old Varney car with a slider on it, as is the caboose. And those sliders go back to the John Allen days, for you guys who remember John. The building there, for what it's worth, was pretty neat. One of the guys in the local division did a laser cut building clinic, and all of us who attended got to build a small laser cut building. This guy went out and invested in a laser cutter, and so he provided us with a building. That wall you see, the retaining wall in the back, that is there because my spouse helped me put it there. Those are 750 matchsticks off of which she cut the heads off for me watching TV. That's not counting the small ends that you also see. So she's, once in a while, she'll come down and look at the railroad. Anyway, we move on down the line a little bit further. We're at Hamilton Farm, and I again, it's central Minnesota. Farming is the big thing, especially in 1955. I also, during the summers, worked on my grandfather's farm in my teen years, later a little bit in college years. He milked about 60, 80 head of Holsteins, so that there had to be Holsteins on there, and there's a few beef cattle, which they had. And my grandfather, there was nothing else. If it wasn't green, it didn't exist. It had to be John Deere. And you see there a John Deere B, which I drove on several summers. There's a planter and the hay baler. That Butler building, that's the Columbia Valley kit. Today, there's a lot easier ways to do that. You can just buy the tanks rather than have to build them and put all that stuff on. If we look to the back, you see there's the Bass Lake Tower that when we were in Bass Lake. That operator has a view, of course, of this farm. And if you look on the other, he looks out his back window. He has a view of the the backwater of Bass Lake and the stream, of course, coming towards it. But also you notice up there, he sees that hobo camp that you can see up there in the upper part of the screen. Now that hobo camp is actually active all the time. And by that, I mean, that hobo camp always has the number of hobos in it that are members of the Tuesday Night Roundhouse. So currently we have 9 members. So if you counted all the hobos there, we have 9 members currently in the group. Here's the Bass Lake itself. And this is, that was in the days of when you poured Envirotex. So this is Envirotex. And first the bottom was painted, you know, the plaster base and painted various colors. Eventually this is poured in about, I think, 5 layers, if I remember, with the top several layers being tinted. So that is the lake itself. When we go to the west, and you notice a lot of these trees, now we're at Memorial Park, which is on the west side of the lake. And again, I was going to say, if you notice the trees, the big one in the center, that's built out of California sagebrush for the trunks. The other 2 on either side of the creek, those are azalea plants, and the trees all have various canopies, but every tree on the railroad was actually hand done. There are no real commercial trees, hardly. There's maybe a few, but not many. Most of the trees are all hand done as such. So anyway, and by the way, Memorial Park, you know, if you notice, this was a kit at one time, and that's where a few of the items came from. Some of the picnic tables are scratched, and yet, as we all know, a railroad's never done. So if you see the flagpole, that's the new Woodland Scenics flagpole that just came out. Yeah, he came out with their flagpoles, and had to add one. My son, before his passing, insisted that this park should have a flag, so it now does. As we pull out of Memorial Park, we end up pulling on to Highway 13, and all of my roads are still done in the old-fashioned patching plaster, or we used to, yeah, so that's what the roads are done with, and painted in acrylics. But you're also, if we went under that open pile Campbell trestle that's there, that will take us eventually here to Little Chicago. But if you notice now, we're at that freight house, that is the east end of Little Chicago. So if you're an operator in Little Chicago, you would end up switching this freight house. And it's got, for a bigger moving, you got the little hook, Alexander kit, little hook on the end. Obviously, I spent with our Minnesota winters, those of you, some may not have to get the pleasure of experiencing, you got usually some more modeling time. And as a result, you I build a few interiors, and most of the buildings do have interiors now. And that roof, for what it's worth, that is hand-carved shingles in the wood, and I've got that done on several buildings. Now, if we jump back onto Highway 13 and we go under that trestle, you get an aerial view here of town of Little Chicago. As you notice on the bottom, there's a fire engine. Now, this is a spring Saturday. Remember, it's late spring 1955. City has just bought themselves a brand new fire engine, so create the scene, and got to have a few hot dogs for the people that come into town to look at it. Next to it is Dee's Cafe, which is scratch built out of styrene. One of the first projects after you read something like L. Armitage's book on styrene. Next door are the Concord Firehouse, where that new fire engine is going to sit. And next to that, eventually it was a Concord Helgen building, but it became the Cornerstone Merchants Row. So this one has a dry goods store in it and a bank on the end. Now, if we move down Highway 13 all the way to the end, you hit Highway 21, and there's a gas station sitting across. And it's things like that. Again, that one I crawled over. That is built exactly to scale as the station sat. It sat in Lydia, Minnesota. And what makes it special and brings back memories continually is if you go under that large oak tree, there's a small door, and it leads to a back small attachment to that gas station. And in there was a 4-seat sandwich ice cream shop. And as a result, my dad bought me many an ice cream cone, and we had lunch in there a few times. Let's go back across the street. You got a Rexall drugstore sitting there, which is the old model die casting modules that you put together. And they were, I believe, the first ones on the market with those. There had to be a Rexall drug because my wife, who worked in the pharmacy for Rexall and for Walgreens and most of her career, started in a Rexall. The rest of the town you see has got a typical small town flavor. Tried to with the bakery. There's the barber shop, the post office. That's where the U.S. flag is. And the green one, every small town had to have a bar or two, right? So this is the Shamrock Bar with the grain belt sign on it. And it was originally the schoolhouse that you see at the top up there by the church scene up there in the rectory. But that when I saw that schoolhouse and scratch built that one, this became, I couldn't throw it away. So turned it into a bar. And the final building is just an AHM. It was their railroad hotel. If you remember, looked like a Western bar with the swinging doors. Well, this has got the upper part of it redone, modified, et cetera, et cetera. That house sitting back there, that sat in Fraser, Minnesota, up in the Evelyn Iron Range. And that house disappeared when they opened up some of the pits because the whole town of Fraser ended up disappearing. So anyway, if you go up to the top, that church, for what it's worth, again, is scratch built. That was scratch built from Chemtron plans. That this church actually sat in it was the St. James Episcopal Church that sat in California. The country schoolhouse there, as I said to you, is schoolhouse. I used to be in the accounting profession, and one of the magazines I got, this happened to be the cover, and it really caught my interest, and so I scratch built it. And as a result, as I said, that's why Shamrock Bar was the old Campbell's Country Schoolhouse that disappeared. The back building you recognize, that's the old Revell or AHM farmhouse. It's got a new roof on it, and it gives it a little bit different flavor. We come down from the church along the road, you see Michael's. That was one of the first buildings I scratch built. That's actually a board by board, but it's done with manila card file, cutting into the board thickness. So you, rather than use wood, this was done with manila card file, board by board, tar paper roof, and Michael's is hand painted. Of course, as I said, my son passed a couple of years ago, so it brings back many of the memories him and I had. Now, you also notice, I wanted to point out in this scene, I probably by now, you've guessed, I love mini scenes. And if you notice by the church, we got a wedding going on. But if you get back to Michael's, you notice there's a bus standing there. Is the bus just sitting there? Is it moving? Well, if you do, and we add a few people to it, I think it adds pizzazz to the railroad. And now you know the bus is definitely standing, and we got some few people getting on, moving on to elsewhere. In that lower right-hand corner, we got a couple employees from the bank taking coffee break, sitting on the bench over there, BSing like we all do in the railroading. Now, if we leave and head up Highway 21, and we cross the tracks, we come to the station. And the station was an Arley, again, AHM Arley plastic kit. It is kit modified, kit bashed, and it now is a copy of what was the Milwaukee Road Station in Everly, Iowa. And as you see, the rest of it, of course, in these days, in 55, many of the stations still had, like you see Lower Center, a small little outhouse there for his and hers. Across the street, or across the tracks, we have, that's just a Campbell's water tank kit built right out of the box. That's one of the few that isn't modified on the railroad. Behind it, that retaining wall, that happens to be no more matchsticks. Spouse wouldn't cut anymore. So this is Campbell's ties put onto a wood base. As we move down from the station, here you see in Little Chicago, if you're the operator there, that's another position on the railroad during operation. You end up passing a lot of trains here. So the passing siding. Now, as you move up the siding, you see there is a milk platform there. Out of Minneapolis, the yard we started on, where all trains are built that are heading westward. One of them is the milk peddler that follows out early in the morning. They pick up all the stops, as I pointed out, like in Bass Lake, the guy farmer sitting there, and here at the milk platform. That actually occurred in Minnesota. It was in the early years of railroading. Probably by the time I'm modeling, 55, it was gone because trucks had replaced that. But It gives a little bit work to operators on the railroad. As you move down along the track, you see like a little loading platform down there at the bottom of the center of the screen. Doug Harding, of course, you guys all know Doug, and he did a wonderful presentation in articles in the Craftsman on the meat packing industry, and we in the various things. Well, as we eventually in the next week get into Northfield, you'll see the Swift complex. And but I read about several articles about LCL being actually cattle shipping as LCL. Many of the farmers could not afford to ship a herd, but they wanted to ship a cow or two, maybe a horse, whatever. And so supposedly these portable platforms were used, and they apparently, I believe, some were used here and there on the Sioux, but I've talked to several guys, and some say yes, some say no. Across the tracks anyway, we get, that's a structure my brother, before his passing, he was a model builder too, not a railroader at all. He thought this was a waste of time, but he decided he wanted to build a building for me. So this is a building, it's just for the track crews, and it's easy to build model railroad structures is where that building came from. The elevator itself is the major customer here in our major customer in Little Chicago. And this is—
Excuse me for a second, Lester, just to let you know, you got 9 minutes.
Right. I'll be done here in just a little bit. The elevator is tinfoil in the kitchen, and it was moved over Baster files. You see the graph paper for the shingles. That's scratch built. It is a copy of the Jordan elevator as it sat on the old Emmons St. L in Jordan, Minnesota, now tore down. Here's the Northwestern. Ron should, that's his favorite railroad, I believe. So on here, we got the Northwestern here serving the second interchange where it brings in cars. You see a flip down there in front that holds about 8 cars a session. Across the track, you got wooden container, scratch built, Bransky Scash and Door, modified kit. You notice down below, if you were an operator in Little Chicago, this is the type of cards I use, 3x5 cards. I'm old school because everything was done in, anyway, and the telephone. Next door, you got a rail fan. I being a grandpa with a grandson who's now 23, I wouldn't hold him anymore, and the granddaughter at Bethel College, but a great rail fan spot for the CNW. We move next, and by the way, in this one, so when the railroad, if you notice there's a Milwaukee or in Minneapolis Northland Reefer out there, grandfather's admiring. That's a scratch-built car, and that's built out of styrene. As I started, the railroad was getting fairly complete, no more structures, and focus went to freight cars. On the left side, you got JDO and Cole, came out, the scratch built out of RMC, eventually became a plastic kit. JDO and Cole, the coaling tower there, built from easy built, scratch built, easy model railroad structures. The cattle pen is a Campbell's, built pretty stock. Again, you see, we ship cattle to Northfield, to the Swift plant. Sheep, they end up going to to the GN interchange to go to South St. Paul stockyards. You see in the backyard, typical switcher. There's a bobber. The bobber, the crews were whining, and they were cold the winter months in September. The snow months. So as a result, each town has a small bobber caboose for the crews to warm themselves when the snow is on the ground. Here we look, and if you look over on the left-hand side is the tunnel, and that switch is to Tunnel City, which we will take up on next Friday, if it's all right with you guys. I'm going to turn it back to,
Very good. Thanks, Lester.
okay,
Yes,
I
very
believe I
good.
have stopped broadcasting.
Nice
Yes,
job.
Very nicely done.
Very nice layout.
Yeah, beautiful.
Lester,
Well, what did you guys think? Pardon?
Lester, this is Rod. I had a chance to visit your layout during the narrow gauge convention a couple of years ago. It was fantastic.
I have
Guys,
seen
can
it
you hear me
several
now?
times now.
Yeah.
Well, I know Doug has also been here on the railroad. He's got a chance to visit too.
Yes, I've been there several times, and the depth of detail and the amount of scratch building, and of late Lester has been really focusing on freight cars, and he's developed some wonderful techniques and has become a very good modeler. Let me put it that way. He's been a good modeler for a long time.
Well,
But,
I appreciate you guys letting me show it to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We
Thanks,
appreciate
Lester.
you showing.
You guys gonna come back? Let me come back next week and finish up?
Absolutely.
Think so.
All right.
You bet.
Thank you, gentlemen.
All right.
You can come
Well,
back. I
yeah.
might not.
You might not.
we got a good recording of that, so I'll post that up tomorrow or Monday, one of these days. But thanks, Lester, and we'll meet up again next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. And thank you
Thank you.
for letting me
All
show you.
right. Thanks, guys.
Take care.
We'll see
Good
you.
Thanks
job.
for running this, Greg.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Bet.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Thanks, Greg.